This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and I'd like to welcome everybody to today's show where we're going to talk about the evolving role of the independent board chairman. And who better to talk about that than an independent chair? And it's my pleasure to welcome Mac Gardner, who's the chairman of Spirit Airlines. Welcome, Mac.
Good morning, TK. Pleasure to be here.
Well, you sort of got this title recently, and so my first question for you that I think people would be a little bit curious about, share with us sort of the thought process when the board sort of invites you or suggests that you may be the good one. What sort of goes through your head before one accepts, a position like that?
Well, in the case of Spirit, I had gone on the board in 2010. Which was pre-IPO. They went public in May of 2011. And the company prior to that had been owned by two private equity firms. So my going on the board initially was in getting ready for going public and having a majority of the directors be independent. After the initial IPO, with lockup periods and the price movement on the stock, the firms that own the company were watching it go up. The company had done well. And then in the summer of last year, in 2013, they were looking at a stock price that had roughly tripled from the time of the IPO and decided it was a good time for them to exit their investment. So on a call in early August, the company was informed that they were going to be selling all their shares and the current chairman was going to be stepping down. All of the other members of the board kind of looked around and looked at me and said, gee, Mac, you've been a good director. Would you like to be the chairman? I thought about it for about a day and I said, sure, why not? It's been an exciting company to be a part of. They had a good board. And we were going to, by virtue of two resignations as a result of the selling of that position, we were going to be looking at adding some new directors too. So it really wasn't that hard a decision to decide to do it. I was very interested in the company and its prospects, and I thought this is something that could be fun.
Well, here you are then, a new chairman. Company's had great growth, as you just mentioned. And you're sitting there as the board chair and you look forward to 2014. Share with us what you see as some of your board chair challenges as a public company looking at 2014.
Okay, well, from my perspective, the number one thing that we need to do is to support management's efforts in continuing to grow the company and do well and be at the top end and the top quartile of their peer group. And in order to do that, you need to do a few things. Obviously, you need to staff all your committees. So you need to have people on the board that are qualified to serve on audit committees and people who are familiar with what goes on in comp committees and nom-gov committees. So I wanted to be sure that we had the right backgrounds and talents for those to serve on those committees. But in addition to that, you also need industry-specific capability. And my background was finance. So the airline business for me, while I'd done some financings over my career, the airline business as an industry was a relatively new one for me to be as involved in as I was as a director. So working with the heads of each of the committees, we have added one director we're going to add who had an airline background. We're going to be probably adding one or two more over the course of the next year or so. And we pay attention to backgrounds in finance. Audit committees are critical positions to fill. Compensation is a little more wide open, but it's always good to have an attorney, someone with HR experience. Those kinds of things are the kinds of people you definitely want on your board, in addition to industry-specific capability.
So Each year, corporate board member holds its chairman, CEO peer forum. And in that, we invite teams of independent chairs or lead directors and CEOs. And the purpose of that peer forum is to sort of establish how successful people have communicated between management and the board. And I'm curious, could you describe a little bit about your relationship with the CEO and what you think are the keys to making sure that you have good communications and, as you say, are providing good support to the management team?
Yeah. Well, the number one thing is regular contact. And in my own business career, my big thing is I don't mind what the news is. I just don't want to be surprised. And the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is to have frequent contact. So I talk to the CFO and the CEO regularly. We actually, as a company, there's a weekly call that's non-mandatory for directors, but it is every Tuesday at 4 o'clock, where we discuss the operations for the previous week and issues that are coming up for the company. So it creates an opportunity for directors, when they have the opportunity, to just sort of keep a real-time sense of snapshot of how things are going. Excuse me. And when you think about the airline business, in a week like we just had, where some airlines were canceling half of their flights because of the weather, those calls can be, while it's not important inside of any particular quarter, it's really good information to have as to how your airline's doing and what are the issues that are affecting it. So, over communicating, I think, is something that you probably couldn't do. And as with any good relationship, you have to spend time with people and get a sense of what people care about, how they communicate, what their style is. And Ben Baldanza, who's the CEO, and I have an excellent relationship. We've each had difficult conversations with each other. My job's to give him feedback, and his job's to give me feedback about the things that he wants out of the board. And my job is to let him know what the board thinks of how we're doing. And so we spend a lot of time talking about people in the C-suite, the senior management team, how they're doing. We have been involved in hiring, in recruiting senior level people into the organization, which in a growth company like this, which is growing 15 to 20% per year, there's a lot of new people that are coming into the organization each and every year. So we try and stay abreast of what's going on in that. But I think it's just like anything else. You have to be present. 90% of the job is just showing up, right, and being there. And that's worked well so far, and it certainly worked well when I was just a director on the board too.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You shared with me that your father has also been a director of a public company, so you at least got some genes to be able to do this. But if you look at his tenure and over time, boards, the transparency of the decisions that happen on boards today it's so much more transparent than what it was even 10 years ago, okay? Yeah. And shareholders are pushing for more and more transparency. So my question to you is, do you believe that transparency has made better boards, or with all that's happened increasing what I'll call shareholder power, do you think that the pendulum has sort of swung too far in the way that boards are being second guessed for everything they're doing?
I think that transparency is a good thing. I think there are decisions that boards make, that management teams make, that there's a period of time when decision making needs to be private. Strategy, tactics, it's a competitive world that we all live in. But the process of making those decisions and the fact that people know that the transparency is out there, I think actually leads to more thoughtful decision making. Knowing that a decision is going to be scrutinized leads to better decision making. and more thoughtful decision making. So, the best defense, if you will, against shareholders who might be unhappy is doing well. And as long as you are focused on your business and how well you can do and doing the best that you can, then shareholders over time are going to be happy. I mean, directors are shareholders too, generally speaking. Certainly the management team has a big stake in having things go the right way. And the dialogue with the shareholder services groups that advocate on behalf of shareholders, I think there is a pendulum element to it, but I think by and large, over a longer period of time, over a 5 to 10 year period, they strike the right balance. It does swing back and forth, but I think over time, I think boards are making better decisions than they did 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. So Mac, one of the questions we like to ask whenever we have a guest on, and certainly a guest that's an active practitioner, is when you look at boardroom trends, sort of what gives you sort of confidence about the future, and then what of those trends in the boardroom sort of concern you today?
Well, with the boards that I serve on, I feel good about the composition of the board, the quality of the executives. I think it's a little bit of a red herring in it has been harder to find people willing to serve as directors, and I think there's a perceived risk and liability that people have in their head when they're thinking about being a director, that if you're being thoughtful and doing your job, I don't think it's something that you need to worry about. But I do think sometimes that it can be harder to find quality candidates to serve on boards than it ought to be. And so I worry about that. Creating an environment where it isn't something for people to be afraid of, but looked at more as doing a good service, right, for public shareholders, I think is where I'd like to see it get to. Increased regulation, you can't be an absentee director, that's for sure, not in this day and age. And regulation and the need to do continuing ed and stay up on best practices in the boardroom, I think is an important component to it also. But I would say that my own experience as being a director has been great, and I really, there isn't anything I'm afraid of. As I said earlier on, that the number one thing I'm as afraid of as a director is a surprise. And as I said, I prefer good news. I can handle bad news, but nobody likes to be surprised. So usually that means that there's something that was going on that either was missed or wasn't paid attention to, and then it shows up, and inevitably those things show up at a time when it's least advantageous for it to happen.
Well, great thoughts, and you're not the first person to say, as the board of directors, the last thing that we want to do is be surprised. So if there's any lesson out there for management, it is no surprises at board meetings. So
for sure.
Great insight, Mac. We appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
That will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical issue that will help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.